The effect of gender on force, muscle activity, and frontal plane knee alignment during maximum eccentric leg press exercise. Introduction. So the purpose, we're trying to determine gender differences when athletes exert leg presses during the eccentric negative phase, the lowering and the lesser elevation, the decrease in elevation of the leg press. Usually it has an angle. Some are vertically at 90 degrees. They wanted to analyze injured or torn anterior cruciate ligaments, because these are typically injured in many sports. Women, however, suffer a greater number of ACL tears in contrast to men. So when the valgus alignment is interfered with or is distorted, you have increased knee abduction going away from the center line of the body, and then this ACL ligament tears. We analyzed, or the scientists from last year analyzed force, knee stabilization, and muscle activity while men and women were exerting maximal leg press movements in the eccentric phase. So in sports you have deceleration and landing from jumps, and this involves an eccentric negative muscle elongation activity. Inherently, women have more disparity in contrast with men regarding the kinematic and neuromuscular control of knee articulation joints, and this provokes ACL tears. So the scientists speculated that the eccentric phase, the negative, would demonstrate greater gender disparity or differences. Previous research doesn't analyze leg pressing frequently or extensively. Regular competitive athletes perform leg press movements frequently or commonly, like I usually do. And scientists hypothesis, men and women do not demonstrate exactly identical or precisely the same force generation, knee stabilization, or muscle activity. This makes sense, but we'll see what the results are. So the methods, scientists in Austria recruited an equal number of men and women, 13 each for men and women, and they were corresponded for age and physical activity to make it fair and balanced. And scientists varied, they changed the stability of the force plates as being stable or unstable, while men and women exerted maximal eccentric leg press movements. So these are high velocity movements that accelerate downwards and then decelerate. So the Austrian scientists measured force, knee stability in the frontal plane, and then muscle recruitment activity of numerous muscles crossing over and connecting over the knee. And for exclusion criteria, people that couldn't participate, athletes, joint symptoms in lower limbs, like severe pain, arthritis, previous musculoskeletal surgery in lower limbs, athletes who are over age 40 like me, metabolic syndrome and rheumatoid arthritis affecting skeletal muscles, other diseases that could injure the musculoskeletal system or show signs or symptoms, and deficient sensory motor performance. So the Declaration of Helsinki was involved for the compliance of this scientific experiment. Skin surface electrodes were installed on muscle bellies, and they were manufactured from silver chloride. So these electrodes have silver chloride. And 6 muscles were involved for the eccentric elongation: vastus lateralis, vastus medialis, biceps femoris, semitendinosus, peroneus longus, and gastrocnemius medialis. So you have 2 from the quadriceps, 2 from the hamstrings, and then 2 from the calf, cruciate lower leg. Raw processed EMG was measured with a Norax and Miles system from Scottsdale, Arizona, and they measured the barefoot right leg. So these skin marker devices, like biomechanists have, were installed in the anterior superior iliac spine, the greater trochanter of the femur bone, the lateral femoral epicondyle, the lateral malleolus, and the leukotronic AS200 machine from Innsbruck, Austria, measured the motion and movement of these skin markers. So they're trying to measure EMG amplitude. And for methods here, they wanted to analyze 2-dimensional motion. They couldn't measure 3 dimensions because of the posterior pelvis coxal bone. The hip was concealed or hidden against the seat of the leg press. Obviously they couldn't analyze that part effectively. And this would involve this 2-dimensional analysis involved the frontal and sagittal planes of the knee joints for both men and women. So the athletes would rotate their knees in flexion downwards at 50 to 95 degrees of knee flexion. And the athletes were restrained with a seat belt, so they couldn't let their glutes rise up. Their hips would stay fixed on the seat. And isokinetic leg pressing produced test reliability, so they chose leg pressing for reliability purposes. The scientists changed the sequential order of the stable and unstable foot plate exertion for half of the men and half of the women to modify the procedure. And EMG was normalized to maximum isometric voluntary contraction for the initial movement. So they normalized EMG. And scientists, so they were varying the normal and perturbed portion of the eccentric leg press movement. So you have either normal or perturbed. And they neglected and abandoned the shortening concentric phase to make it more simple. However, this actually probably should have been included, in my opinion. Eccentric muscle elongations are faster. They have high velocity in contrast to concentric contractions. So the concentric contractions are almost always slower, almost always. And then high velocity, so you have these cutting and jumping movements in sports, and they involve high velocity, and this helps to contribute to the potential for female ACL tearing in women. It's the high velocity. So there's a correlation between the eccentric leg press, because it moves very fast, and so does the high velocity of the cutting and jumping. And then for results, they didn't measure any significant differences, believe it or not, for men and women for the eccentric leg press movements. So their forced knee stability and muscle activity was almost identical for men and women. Again, many ACL tear injuries occur through sports that are non-contact. The athletes don't really touch, shove, and tackle each other and hurt each other with a physical shoving or touching or manipulation. Physiological variables like the anatomical, hormonal, biomechanical, and neuromuscular activities must function synergistically together. However, you need to define in your protocol what these anatomical variations, endocrine responses, biomechanical changes, and neuromuscular interactions are. You needed to consider those because that might affect the results. And scientists should determine or learn why women experience a greater number of ACL tears. Women engage in cutting and jumping movements, and perhaps this might be related to endocrine responses of the estrogen hormones. The women's high angular velocity may affect the ACL tearing or shearing or rupturing. And here's a table showing percentages of inactive, minimally active, health-enhancing physical activity, and then the total number of athletes, 26. And you can see peak force, stable and unstable, measured significance, less than 0.05. P less, probability less than 0.05. Mean force stable, mean force unstable. However, the NS that you see in the far right-hand column at the very end, it's NS, 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 so non-significant. So the men and women measure almost the same mean alignment and amplitude alignment. And then again, you have all these NS values that were measured, non-significant. For vastus lateralis, vastus medialis, biceps femoris, semitendinosus, pylornis longus, gastrocnemius medialis, and then these ratios of the quads and hamstrings, they're non-significant. So the force stabilization deficit, it didn't show any contrast between men and women. It wasn't significant for maximal eccentric leg presses. So the frontal plane leg stabilization and muscle activity were almost identical, and their differences were insignificant. So the gender divergencies and differences involving force, leg kinematics, and muscle activities were not measured as significant. So scientists from Austria have concluded that their research may contradict prior or past research from previous scientists. So they caution, admonish, and warn us on this gender conclusion because the men and women are almost the same exerting eccentric leg presses. And so leg press velocity on the machine is 0.20 meters per second, 1/5 meter per second, which is usually less than the cutting and jumping that athletes engage in sports. So there's an inherent risk with the sport, but the leg press seems to be safer and more protective for the athletes because it doesn't require previous training regimens and scheduling, and the injured athletes can perform leg presses relatively soon or early after ACL reconstruction.